Hey guys, Will here. So today we're taking a look at one of the most hyped set of sim racing pedals available on the market today. These are the VRS Direct Force Pro pedals. And I'm going to preface this with a bit of a spoiler alert. These are some of my favorite pedals that we've ever tested here at Boosted Media. And that is saying a lot. We've tested a lot of pedals here. Now that not only goes for the driving experience, but also the price to performance ratio on these pedals is really, really fantastic. So let's dive in now, take an objective look at all the things you need to know about these pedals. And by the end of today's video, you should have a good understanding of whether these are going to be the pedals for you. So before we get started here, a couple of important housekeeping things as always. So firstly, a big thank you to VRS for sending these pedals across to us to check out. And we will be making some comparisons with some other pedal sets in today's video. All of those pedals were also provided under the same conditions to us as well. So there's no preferential treatment or anything like that going on there. Everything that we're going to be talking about today is purely our own observations and our own opinions, no editorial control by any other third parties in the process of making this video. Now, if you do decide you want to pick up one of these pedals, unfortunately, I don't have any affiliate partners available for them right now at the time of shooting this video, but check the links down in the description below. If we do bring any on, or we do have any options or discounts or anything like that, we'll make that known down in the comments section as well as the description box. And of course, you can also jump on our website, boostedmedia.net, for a written review of these, and we'll give you any other additional information that may be relevant there as well. Okay, so the best place to start here is with pricing. I mentioned at the start of the video that these have a really good price to performance ratio. Now they are still quite expensive. You're looking at $649 US or 549 euro, including VAT. That equates to 779 Australian dollars for the throttle and brake. If you want to pick up the clutch as well, that is available separately for 249 US, 199 euro VAT inclusive, or 279 Australian dollars. Now, obviously, check your local pricing, shipping, and all those things on any other pedals that we're comparing to today. But to give you I guess a good point of comparison here, it puts them a little bit more expensive than the Husingveld Sprint pedals and a little bit cheaper than the Husingveld Ultimate pedals. Now, interestingly, I would compare these more closely to the Husingveld Ultimate Plus pedals than the Sprint pedals, and those reasons will become evident throughout today's video. But if you are interested in more information on the Husingveld Sprints or Ultimate Plus, we have detailed reviews just like this one on both of those pedal sets, and I'll drop links to both of those down below. Now, while we're on the subject of Husingveld pedals, one thing that I do want to address here is that we do see quite a few pedal sets on the market these days, which are pretty much just direct copies of Husingveld pedals. Now, these may look a little bit like that at face value. Obviously, there are a lot of design elements here that are quite similar, but the fundamental approach here is actually quite different, particularly as it relates to the brake. So that's one thing that we're going to be focusing on in quite a bit of detail in today's video. Now, the one thing that stood out to me immediately when we started this review process was that these really appeared to be a product that were engineered specifically for sim racing, rather than something that was trying to just emulate or translate technology from a real life car directly into sim racing. Now, the reason why I highlight that is that in particular in the last couple of years since the pandemic situation, we have seen a lot of automotive specialist companies kind of move across from the real life automotive scene into sim racing. Obviously, there was a huge spike in interest in sim racing and a lot of money to be made from sim racing hardware, particularly over the last couple of years. So we've seen some examples of really good implementations of that. Things like the Acertec Invicta pedals, for example. Those are doing their best to simulate the feeling that you get in a real life race car. And in my opinion, at least, they do a really great job of that. Those are the pedals that I've been running on my daily driver sim rig for the better part of the last year now, in fact. But we have also seen some examples of pedals, and again, we have reviews of all of these right here on the channel if you want to dig and have a look, that don't translate quite so well. And what I mean by that is some of them can be very noisy, and while that doesn't matter in the context of a real life race car, when you're in a sim racing context and you've got people trying to sleep next door, maybe somebody trying to study or watch TV right next to you, little details like that can be deal breakers. So one of my observations and one of the things that I really like about these pedals is the fact that they have been designed specifically for sim racing, not only in terms of how they operate and their quietness, their smoothness, all those important things, but also in the fact that the feeling that you get when driving with these pedals is very much conducive to driving quickly and consistently, although it may not necessarily be the most authentic feeling pedal set that we've tested here. And of course, that is going to depend on the type of car in real life that you're comparing it to. No pedal set is going to be able to emulate exactly every single type of car that's available. And obviously street cars can be very, very different from race cars too. But I wanted to highlight that immediately here because it is something that is quite different about the approach that they've taken here. And I think that's something that has paid off really, really well in how these pedals drive and also the price to performance. So let's take a deeper dive now into the mechanical design of each of these pedals. Now you'll notice that all three pedals are utilizing load cell technology, which means that they measure the amount of strain or the amount of deflection across a piece of metal, and that is how they interpret the pedal position. So if we take a quick look at the throttle pedal here, you can see a tiny little load cell in the front here. I'm not sure exactly what the load rating on that is, but all it is responsible for is purely just relaying the amount of spring pressure which is being exerted across that strain gauge. So you can see as I push the throttle pedal down, that spring is compressing, and that spring force is being directly applied to the load cell here. The load cell is fixed on the pedal arm. So you can imagine as that spring pressure increases, we get a little bit of deflection on this part of the load cell here. And you can see there's a little cutout inside there. Literally all it's doing is just measuring the deflection between the two halves there. That deflection is then interpreted as pedal position. Now the clutch pedal is utilizing a similar design too. So you can see we've got the load cell mounted to the pedal arm. Now that is a higher rated load cell than what we have on the throttle pedal because we have a stiffer spring here. So obviously we don't want to oversaturate the measurement range of the load cell. So as we push that clutch pedal down, again, the same kind of idea, the spring is compressing and that spring tension is then exerted on the strain gauge load cell, and that is interpreted as our pedal position inside the game. Now with the brake pedal, things are a little bit different. Fundamentally, it's essentially the same kind of design. As you're pushing the pedal down, is a spring force exerted on the load cell. And you can see in the case of the brake pedal, this is actually a 200 kilogram load cell. Now, the reason why we need a much more highly rated load cell in the brake pedal as opposed to the throttle and the clutch pedal is you can imagine here, again, as we push the pedal down, the only force that's being exerted, as we explained before, is purely just that spring pressure and resistance being pushed back onto the load cell. But you've got to find that amount of movement here before you hit that mechanical bump stop, which obviously limits the amount of spring force which is going to be applied to the load cell. Same kind of idea with the clutch too, although it is a stiffer spring here. But with the brake pedal, because we're not likely to ever actually hit that mechanical bump stop, a lot more force is able to be exerted on that load cell than what we have with the throttle and the clutch. Now, if you've been paying close attention, and hopefully you have been, you will have noticed by now that they're using a metal or coil spring here on the brake pedal rather than the rubber or elastomer material that we normally see on load cell pedals. Now, every material is going to have a limit at some point as to how many cycles that it can go through. We've seen quite a few different types of designs with load cell pedals using elastomer material. The designs that we've liked have been the ones that actually limit the amount of compression that the elastomers are able to go through. Some of the pedals, like the BJ Sim Racing pedals, for example, didn't have any sort of limitation there. So the harder you push the pedal, the more those elastomers blow out. And I use the term blow out because they do have a maximum rated amount of deflection which they're supposed to be able to handle. And if you push beyond that point, then obviously they're going to weaken and fatigue over time. One of the issues there is not only the physically breaking and falling apart, but also the fact that the more cycles they go through, the weaker they become, which can actually change the feeling of the pedal over time. And obviously pedal feel is extremely important. Consistency is important because you're wanting to establish muscle memory and be able to brake consistently. So the really good designs, at least in my opinion, are ones like the Mecha Cup 1 pedals, for example, that have little metal cups that actually limit the amount of deflection available to mitigate that issue. Now, obviously metal fatigue is a thing as well. So I'm not saying that this spring can't break or that it's necessarily more reliable than an elastomer system, but this does have the advantage of compressing up. So if we use the weaker spring here that they include, you can imagine that will compress to a point, but once all those individual loops are all touching each other, that will limit the amount of total compression there that's available rather than just, blowing out an elastomer further and further and further. So at least in theory, this should be more reliable than what we've seen in some of those less highly engineered elastomer type designs. Now, the reason they say they've gone with the coil spring design, and I'll quote them verbatim here, is to provide a consistent and friction-free response. Now, generally speaking, with elastomers, you're not going to have any friction either unless they're in some sort of a canister like what we have with the Acertec Forte pedals, for example, and you can check out that review linked down in the description. Now, I haven't had any issues personally with any binding in those pedals, but you can imagine if the elastomer is compressing inside some sort of a housing, there is the opportunity there for some sort of binding to take place. So you can imagine as you're pushing down the pedal, if those elastomers are expanding and making contact with something, then there is obviously going to be friction created there, and that could create a binding kind of effect, or may need to require lubrication like what we have with the Fanatic V3 pedals, for example. If you don't lubricate those pedals, and same thing with the Logitech G Pro pedals that we reviewed recently too. If you don't lubricate those pedals, then you do feel all sorts of weird binding things going on in the pedals. So this kind of design alleviates all of that without introducing the issue of those elastomers being able to blow out beyond their design tolerance. Now, the other interesting thing about this brake design is we've got this lever kind of assembly here, which is actually quite similar to what we see on a lot of other clutch pedals, which gives us that kind of two-stage effect. So what's happening here is you can see as we initially start to push down on the pedal, this whole assembly rotates around. So it pivots on this bolt just here. So you can see if I push down with my hand, we've got that little bit of, I don't want to call free play because it isn't just pure slop. There is a little bit of resistance there and it is smooth, but it gives us that sensation of that uptake between the pad and the rotor in a real car before we actually start to apply braking pressure. Now this is fully adjustable and we will talk about adjustment in just a minute. But the way this works is you've essentially got a tie rod here which will allow you to adjust the amount of free play, for want of a better word, in the pedal. So what happens is as you push the pedal, you get a really nice, clearly defined threshold point, which you can use for threshold braking. That's one of the things that I really, really love about these pedals. They have such a great threshold point, which really allows you to build a lot of confidence in your braking. And we'll see that later on when we go for a drive. Now they do include a couple of different springs. We've actually got the stiffer spring, which isn't installed by default, installed here. They come pre-installed with the weaker spring here. Now, just to give you an idea of those spring ratings, with the default blue spring installed, the brake has a maximum pedal force of 65 kilos, which is similar to what we have with the Hussey-Velt sprint pedals, for example. With the red spring installed, like what we see here, that maximum amount of pedal force, again, that being the amount of force that you can apply with your foot to the face of the pedal, not the amount of force that's being applied to the load cell. It's important to understand the difference between those. That is increased to 140 kilos. Obviously, you don't need to calibrate it that high, but you can go up to that amount of force if you want to. And I like to brake between about 70 and 80 kilograms. So having this set with the red spring and then calibrating it so that my 80% pressure mark is around about that 70 to 80 kilo mark works really well for me, but we'll take you through that a little later on in today's video. So obviously the difference between 65 kilograms and 140 kilograms of pedal force is more than double. And that's one of the things that I really love about these pedals as well, is just the amount of measurement range, particularly in the brake, which is achievable there. You really can adjust this to provide anything from, you know, something like a Formula style car where you really want to have a stiff pedal with a lot of force required, to something more like a street car where you can have quite a soft pedal. And yeah, look, honestly, throughout the last couple of weeks that we've been testing these pedals, we tested it throughout the entire range on the brake pedal. And yeah, it really does. I can't imagine anybody wouldn't be happy with the type of feel that they're able to achieve with this pedal. Now, I'm not going to take you through every single adjustment that's available on all three pedals. VRS have a really fantastic adjustment video, which we'll link down in the description below, which takes you through all the things you need to be aware of. It is quite a complex process, and I don't want this video to be any longer than it needs to be. But what I will do is just quickly run you through the key adjustments which are available. So all three pedals have adjustments available for the throw distance, the spring preload, and pedal response curve. So the pedal response curve being the way the pedal actually mechanically feels underfoot in relation to the amount of force that's being applied. In terms of the ergonomics, all pedals allow for an overall tilt angle change of 21 degrees. So you just loosen off the bolts on either side here, as well as the pivot point, and that allows you to tilt each of the pedals up and down like so. Now these can be a little bit tricky to undo. They're done up very tight from the factory. So you kind of need to do both sides at once, kind of crack them, and then you can loosen them off from there. If you loosen one side and then try to do the other side, what's going to happen is the entire little insert's just going to spin around. So it is a little bit trickier than I would like it to be, but it's good that they have that adjustment available there. And most pedals that we've seen with this kind of design do operate in a similar manner there. So it's not really a complaint, but just something to be aware of. Can be a bit of a pain to adjust the angle. And then on top of that, the pedal faces themselves have an adjustment range of 30 degrees angle-wise. So you can see a huge amount of angle adjustment there. And then on top of that as well, they also have 20 millimeters of depth adjustment. So that allows you to go in and out like so, like that, if that makes sense. And then 30 millimeters of vertical adjustment, so up and down. And again, this can be a little bit tricky to adjust. You might need to just loosen some of the surrounding areas like what I've done here, just to make it move a little bit more freely so it doesn't scratch up the nice finish that we have here. And then in addition to that, you can see all three pedals also have a bump stop adjustment here too. Probably not going to be making use of that on the brake pedal for most people unless you're running a really, really soft setup and you are finding you max out the travel. But of course, remember that if you are maxing out the travel, any pressure that you apply beyond that point won't be actually making its way across to the load cell. So you probably don't want to configure your pedal that way. But as it relates to the throttle pedal, it gives us a maximum throw of 20.3 degrees or 20.3 degrees of rotation as you see it here, or 58.1 millimeters of travel in the maximum position, or down to a minimum of 7.5 degrees or 21.5 millimeters of travel. So again, there the maximum is more than double the minimum, so a huge range of adjustment. Now this will vary slightly, of course, depending on how you adjust your pedal face as well because of the leverage provided there. So that can adjust by plus or minus 9%. It gives us a maximum configurable pedal force of 8.4 kilograms on the throttle pedal. Now we'll get into this more when we go for a drive in just a minute, but one thing I will say here, because it's relevant to what we're talking about, is the fact that the pedal does have a nice progressive feel. So you do feel progressively more resistance as you push down the pedal, which again does aid with developing more kind of force-based muscle memory rather than just purely the position of your ankle. So in terms of throw, the clutch pedal is adjusted in a similar fashion. We've got the little bump stop here. Now, the thing that I really like about this is, as I mentioned earlier, we do have that kind of two-stage effect here where the clutch pedal becomes softer beyond a certain point to give you the sensation of the bite point inside the clutch. Now, what we can do here and what I have done is adjust the maximum amount of throw available to just behind where that rollover point is. I find it a little bit difficult to launch cars consistently just with my mediocre driving skills when I do have that two-stage thing. So I'm not a big fan of that effect. So it's good to know that you can actually dial that out if you don't like it. So you can have a nice linear feeling clutch pedal, or you can have that kind of two-stage effect if you increase the throw. And just to give you the numbers there, we've got an adjustment range of 25.4 degrees of pivot as it relates to the pivot point down the bottom, or 77.1 millimeters of throw, all the way down to 12.4 degrees or 37.8 millimeters of travel. And again, that will vary by plus or minus 9% depending on how you've got your pedal face adjusted. So we've covered pretty much everything that there is to cover in terms of the mechanical design and how the pedals actually function. Just wanted to talk a little bit more about the materials used before we get in and look at the software and driving experience. So we're using stainless steel throughout the entire construction pretty much here. So the pedal faces, the pedal arms, cages, and mounting points are all laser cut. That is using FEA technology as well. And that stands for finite element analysis. Basically what they do is they create a virtual simulation of the materials, and they use that simulation to determine how it's going to actually perform in real life. So obviously they do real world testing with these as well, and they do extensive testing with a bunch of different sim racers as part of their VRS team. But they also do that software-based analysis as well to make sure that everything's going to work in theory before they go and laser cut everything and go into production. Now, another thing you would have noticed here as well is how smooth and quiet the operation is. So they're using shielded and flanged ball bearings in all of the pivot points. And then they're also using what they describe as custom PTFE inserts on any of those pivot points as well. So again, that just reduces any metal to metal contact, any grinding, any kind of friction or anything. It reduces the amount of friction to ensure as smooth operation as possible. And it certainly seems to have done the trick. There's absolutely no complaints when it comes to any of that stuff in the driving experience. Now, in terms of wiring, they've actually used Cat6 cable to run up to each of the load cells with an RJ45 termination. So basically just a Cat6 network cable. Those are shielded connections as well, as you can see. And I do like the design choice of using nice thick cables like this. Makes them a little bit more durable compared to some of the other pedals that we've tested in the past. And then we get this little control module here as well, as you can see, a metal housing. So it is shielded. We've got 3 RJ45 network points there. So each of the pedals just connect to the amplifier circuit internally. When you calibrate the pedals, it will determine which one is connected to which pedal. So there's no assignment there in terms of what has to be connected to what. We've got a USB-B connection on the opposing side, and obviously they include a USB cable for you as well. We've got mounting points here on the enclosure as well for mounting it to your rig. And if we open this up and have a look internally, we've got an STM32 processor, which is a pretty commonly used processor across a lot of sim racing gear these days. They're also using an external A to D converter here as well, which is an AD71 8193, and that's described on the technical data sheet as an ultra low noise analog to digital converter. That is obviously going to be important. We are dealing with very, very, very finite measurement ranges here, particularly in the case of the lower rated load cells for the throttle and the clutch pedal. So the difference between nothing and full scale deflection is quite small in terms of the voltage being outputted. So the signal to noise ratio needs to be as low as it can possibly be. Now, just in relation to the electronics here as well, one question that we always get asked about pedals is what is the resolution? So I believe what we have here is 16-bit resolution, which gives us 65,538 points of resolution or data throughout the movement of each pedal. So you can imagine as you push your throttle pedal down, it's going through 65,000, 538 steps as we go down. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. Obviously, how you calibrate the pedals will influence that. Now, in particular with relation to the brake pedal, given again that we have a maximum amount of force at the pedal face available of up to 140 kilograms, you can imagine if you're calibrating that down more towards the lower end, then you're only going to be taking advantage of half of that resolution. But honestly, guys, if you can feel the difference between 30,000 steps and 65,000 steps of resolution across a pedal stroke of say 50 millimeters, then you're definitely doing a lot better than I am. I think anything over a couple of thousand on a pedal set is more than adequate. So one more thing that I think we need to touch here on the throttle pedal, I'm going to set the other two guys aside just for now. I know somebody in the comments will have noticed the fact that this spring looks a little bit bent here and that there's no connecting rod between the back of the pedal and the pedal arm here. Now, the reason why they've designed it this way, they say, is to completely eliminate any friction in the pedal. And you can imagine if we pull the Heusinkveld Sprint pedals in here and have a look at their throttle pedal, you can see we've got a little arm here which slides through the back of the assembly. Now, look, honestly, I've never noticed any sort of friction in these pedals at all anyway, or any other throttle pedal that uses a similar design. They do have a little Teflon type insert at the back here, but in fairness, it is a friction point. Obviously, anytime you have metal sliding through something, that is creating friction. Now, is it completely eliminating friction? I would argue no, because we do still have obviously a ball bearing mechanism inside the pivot point here, and there will still be a little bit of friction inherent there, although again, I can't feel anything. But yeah, look, from a driver's perspective, it is absolutely as smooth as they come. I haven't tested any other throttle pedals that feel smoother than this, so obviously it's doing the job that it is intended to do. Now, you may be a little bit concerned by the bend in the spring here. Admittedly, it does look a little bit janky, but look, I don't think from a mechanical engineering perspective it's a problem. I'm not a mechanical engineer. I need to let you guys know that. But again, if you are a mechanical engineer, let us know what you think down in the comments, of course. But at the point where it's under the most pressure here, or the most critical point, you can see the way it's adjusted at the moment, which is the default adjustment from factory. It is a little bit offset down lower, but it's pretty straight throughout. And I would argue that the metal is being stressed a lot more just through its natural compression, which is obviously within its design tolerance, than the amount of fatigue that would be occurring from a little bit of offset like that. So yeah, logic would tell me that it's not an issue, but if you're a mechanical engineer and you think otherwise, let us know down in the comments. So we've made it through our look at the hardware. Let's dive now into the software and the all-important driving experience. Download the zip file, extract it, and that gives us the VRS Direct Force Pro config executable. Now, as you've probably noticed here, it is the exact same software package we use to run the VRS Direct Force Pro wheelbase if you have one of those. So you can check out the review of that if you haven't already. We did an update video just recently on that as well and what the experience is like now, so definitely check that out. Links in the description. But you got the little drop-down menu here. You click on VRS Direct Force Pro pedals. And the first thing it's going to do here is prompt us to update the firmware. So I'm just going to really quickly take you through that process. We click on Enter Bootloader. We point it to the correct file, which we already pre-downloaded from their website. Click on Open. Updating firmware updated successfully. So provided that everything works the way it's meant to, it is as simple as that for updating the firmware. You can see we go back to the pedals now. They show as completely connected. So it's quite tidy the way they've integrated everything into the one software package. So just to give you a quick rundown on what we have here, we've got the ability to save and load different profiles. The profiles, as I understand, are stored on the control module themselves. So if you move to a different PC, that calibration will come with you. That's important for iRacing in particular, which has its own calibration. What that means is when you calibrate in iRacing, you just need to push each pedal down to the maximum, and that calibration that's stored on the pedal box will take effect. So as you've probably already noticed on the screen here, we've got a reading for the clutch sitting at 21.2%. Now, because the ports aren't labeled on the control module, it doesn't actually matter which one you plug into which spot. The calibration process will take care of that. So you can see at the moment, the clutch is actually assigned to my throttle pedal. So let's go through and run the calibration quickly here. So release all pedals and press next. Pretty self-explanatory. Press the throttle pedal to the desired max travel and press next. Desired max travel, press next. Release, press next. Brake pedal with the maximum force. Now, what I suggest here is not going maximum forces in as hard as you can possibly press it. What we want to do here is the maximum amount of pressure that we would ever want to have to apply to reach 100% braking pressure inside the game. Now, remember, dependent on the type of car that you're driving, you probably aren't going to be wanting to actually reach 100% brake pressure in the game anyway. So what I would recommend is push the pedal to where you feel the threshold point, so where you'd be threshold braking, and there is a nice transition on these pedals that we'll talk about in a moment. Now, remembering as well that this will need to be recalibrated if we change the configuration mechanically of the pedal too. So we're going to push to our maximum point there and then push a little bit harder. That is as hard as I would ever want to have to brake inside the sim. And then we're going to click next and then go back to neutral position and click next. Again, we want to take our foot completely off the pedal here, just to calibrate the dead zone correctly, and then we'll be able to adjust that later on too. So next step, and then same deal with the clutch, maximum amount, next, minimum amount, next, and then click save to save those settings. And as we can see now, clutch is operating as expected. We release it, it goes back down to 0, brake, pushing to our threshold point gives me about 80% braking pressure, which is exactly what I wanted, and then I can push harder than that to achieve 100% braking pressure should I wish to do so. If I release it, it goes back to 0. We've got a little bit of a dead zone there, so I can rest my foot on the pedal ever so slightly, but I probably will want to calibrate in a little bit more than that because I do have a habit of resting my foot against the pedal, and we definitely don't want to be braking unintentionally. And then throttle pedal, 100%, no problem there. Release it and back to 0. So calibration, absolutely no issue at all. Then on the right-hand side here, quickly, we have the ability to set a non-linear response curve for each of our pedals. We can adjust it in 20% steps all the way up to 100%. So say, for example, you're driving a low-powered car, you want to be able to get on the throttle very quickly out of corners to get as much speed as possible. You might want to set a faster response curve. You might want to crank up these values for the throttle. For brake, I generally recommend running a pretty linear brake response curve. You kind of want to rely on your muscle memory in changing between different cars. But if you do want to change it for one particular car that has really funny brakes, maybe you can do that. And again, you can save profiles for each individual car or sim, depending on what you want to do. And then for the clutch, it's purely just going to be down to adjusting this so that the curve matches the kind of threshold point that you want to feel inside the car that you're driving. And then on the right-hand side here, we've got our adjustment for maximum force and minimum force. So say, for example, you're having an issue where you're not quite reaching 100% throttle. Maybe you've got a habit of not quite pushing the pedal mechanically all the way to the floor. You can set that value a little bit lower, and it's going to enable you to always make sure that you're achieving that 100% input. But I'm going to set that back to 95% for now. And for minimum force, you can kind of think of this like a bottom dead zone. So for example, with the brake, as I was explaining before, when I rest my foot on that brake, I am registering a little bit of input that you can see there. So what I would probably do is raise that to say, maybe let's try 15%. And now when I rest my foot on the brake, you can see it's not reading anything until I push a little bit more intentionally on that pedal. So again, you kind of don't want to have to, make adjustments to work around bad habits. It's better to reset those habits, and buying a new set of pedals is a great time to establish new muscle memory and new good habits. But if you are just unable to break the habit, then you can do that. And I'm probably actually going to leave that there for the purpose of this video for now. And same deal again with the throttle and the clutch. If you're finding that you're dragging a little bit on the clutch, maybe you're resting your foot on the clutch while you're driving, again, you can add some minimum force there to tune that out. And that is a quick rundown on the software. Again, remembering that these settings are all committed to the EEPROM on the control module, so it will follow you if you go to a different PC or reload your software or something like that. So let's jump in now and talk about what it's like to drive with the pedal. So quick initial impressions before we jump out on the track. Now what we're gonna do is spend quite a bit of time driving with these pedals before we record the next segment. So we've got that experience under our belt before we get into the nitty gritty of things. But just as a top level initial impression, first thing that jumps out at me immediately is just how smooth and quiet these are in operation. All three pedals, extremely smooth, no binding, no kind of grittiness or grinding or anything like that present at all. They're very, very, very fluid and very, very smooth indeed. So I expected that obviously, but always a good thing to find. There's no sloppiness or slack in any of the pedals either. Now, obviously how you adjust the pedals will determine ultimately whether you have anything like that in. Now, the pedals are in their default configuration at the moment, but there have been some pedals that we've tested that just always have that little bit of initial slop or disconnection in the pedal, regardless of how you adjust them. Now, this is very, very, very light on the brake at the moment. That is purely just down to how it's been adjusted. We'll obviously be playing around with that a little bit later on into the driving experience, but there's no side to side slop or movement there at all either. Very solid construction overall, definitely in terms of how they feel underfoot, up there with the best build quality that we've seen. But yeah, look, overall, very, very high-end feel. They're nice and quiet in their operation too. You can hear the throttle pedal is probably the loudest of them, and there is a tiny little bit of reverberation through that spring on the return, but it's certainly not annoyingly loud like some other pedals that we've tested in the past. Brake pedal is genuinely absolutely silent, and clutch has a bit of a clunk when you hit the end. And those soft bump stops do feel really nice as well. So let's jump in now and go for a drive. Okay, so I've done a couple of laps here now with the completely out of the box default settings. I want to sort of use this as a baseline of comparison when we come back and talk about my final settings in just a moment's time. So we'll spend a good, probably couple of days driving with these pedals and fine tuning, really getting them dialed into how I find I really like them, and then do a bit of a comparison. But I wanted to talk a little bit now about what I'm feeling in terms of sensation, what the car's doing, and how I'm able to sort of control what's going on, even though it doesn't really suit the muscle memory that I have established. Because I know obviously not everybody's gonna drive exactly the same as I do, and not everybody's gonna wanna have the pedal as stiff as I do either. So I'm really interested to see how the definition scales up with the stiffer settings later on. But I can tell you, even though you're gonna see me locking up all over the place just because it's set up so light at the moment, the amount of definition that you feel around that threshold point is very, very, very good. And they're just so smooth as well. There's so much finesse in the braking. And I think that's one thing you have to be really careful of when you set up a brake pedal. You don't want it to be so stiff that your inputs become explosive. You do need to have that finesse in the inputs. And I think if you are the sort of person that really has a feather touch on the brake, then these are gonna suit you really, really, really well, which is why I wanted to include this in the video, even though my driving might be absolutely sucking at the moment. I think, you know, if I gave it a couple of days driving with these settings, I'm sure I could learn to be as fast as I am with my normal settings. But yeah, I can control the inputs. You can see where I skidded off in the past there as well, but modulating those inputs, really sort of trail braking in. And as you guys know, we use this track and car combination because it is such a difficult car to drive. It's rear engine, so it's like a pendulum under brakes, no ABS, and this track in particular has a lot of off camber, a lot of tricky transitions and things that can really throw this car in the bin. So it makes it a particularly challenging car and track combination to drive. But what we'll do now is spend a couple of days fine tuning everything, get it all dialed into exactly as I like it, and then do a bit of a comparison as I crash into the wall here. So let's do that now. So we've spent a whole chunk of time now driving with these pedals, changing things, adjusting things, trying again, moving things, adjusting, trying again. And look, the long and the short of this is basically that there's such a huge scope of adjustment available on these pedals, particularly in the case of the brake and the clutch, that it's purely a transformative experience between one end of the scope of adjustment and the other, which means, you know, it's fantastic in terms of being able to dial it into what's going to suit your personal preference. It makes it hard to sort of describe what I'm feeling because it varies so much from, you know, adjustment to adjustment. So I'll talk you through exactly where I've landed with the settings and how they're different from what we were experiencing before. And hopefully between the two segments, it gives you an idea of what's possible. And we'll sort of wrap things up in the conclusions talking about that as well. So the thing that I didn't like about the clutch initially in that default setup, and I kind of said, some people might prefer that, was that big rollover point, that big threshold point where it kind of stepped across and into the second stage. Now, the reason I didn't really like that is because it made it quite difficult to hold the clutch at a threshold and then release it, because it kind of just wanted to, punch out. What I've done is I've reduced the throw of the pedal to just before that threshold point, and now I have a nice linear release. So if I rev the car up in, I should probably put it in neutral first, rev it up, get it in first gear, and then let it out. Very, very, very easy to launch the car. And you can see if I you'd normally be using a two-stage clutch with this car anyway, but I can release it very, very smoothly like that without it sort of wanting to jerk. So again, it's purely down to personal preference here, but the point I'm trying to make is that whether you like a real sort of two-stage feel or a nice linear feel, you can achieve that with this clutch, and it's smooth regardless of the adjustment too. So, and relatively easy to adjust there as well with just moving the threshold for the throw. So that was nice and easy. The only other adjustment that I actually ended up making at the end of the day, once we tried pretty much everything, was just changing over to the red spring in the brake pedal and slightly shortening the length of the tie rod as well, just to make it a little bit softer, a little bit more, not slack, but a little bit more uptake, just to sort of simulate that sensation of the gap between the pads and the rotor on the real car being taken up. So once I did that, the pedals became very, very familiar and I had a lot more control. Remembering again that I do normally brake between 70 and 80 kilograms of force, and I am used to using very, very stiff hydraulic pedals. Now, one of the things that I often say in my pedal review videos is that you don't want to fall into the trap of trying to make your brand new pedals that you've just spent a whole chunk of money on feel exactly like the pedals that you're used to. And it's such a tempting thing to do, because you've gotten used to your old pedals, you're as fast as you're going to be with your old pedals, and then you put on something new, you completely blow away all your muscle memory, and you find that you're way, way, way slower than you were with the old pedals. You go, oh, this is crap, I want to go back to what I had before, these pedals are horrible. So I've intentionally here spent a lot of time experimenting with the full range of adjustment rather than just trying to tune them to feel like my Acertec Invicta pedals, which I absolutely love and I'm perfectly happy with. Now, where I've landed with these pedals is pretty much exactly the same kind of feel in the threshold point as what I have with my Invictas. Now, that is particularly impressive when you consider how much cheaper these pedals are than a hydraulic set of pedals to begin with, but also the fact that they're load cell pedals. So generally speaking, load cells do tend to feel like pushing up against a block of rubber more than mechanically connected to something inside the car. Look at all these skid marks all over the road from me testing things. Craziness. But yeah, really, really impressed with the feel that I've been able to achieve here. So what I want to do now, just kind of drive around a little bit, give you a bit of a sense of exactly what's going on with the way I've adjusted it. So again, I've gone for a really clearly defined threshold point. So I'm wanting to be able to always hit that sort of 80% brake pressure with consistency and feel a threshold there where I can modulate around it without spearing off the road or without locking up. And a little touch on the brakes here just to get the car rotated, and then more heavily into the brakes, get it around, back on the throttle. We'll talk about the throttle in just a minute too, because I am really loving that as well. But as we come into the braking zone here, braking at about the 80-meter mark, and just threshold braking in, getting the car rotated, back on the throttle, modulating around, trying not to lose the back end. I'm really not great at driving this car, but it is such a great car to test these kinds of things out with. Braking again pretty much at the apex, and just sitting on that threshold, riding it through as we start to turn in, backing off. Remembering again our traction circles, so the more we're asking of the car in terms of rotation, the less we can put through in terms of braking, because the tyres can only handle a certain amount of force of any one type. So always imagining that there's a piece of string connected between the steering wheel and the pedal, and as you rotate the wheel, you have to let off the pedal. It's always a good way to visualize it. So braking at 200, again, hitting that threshold pretty cleanly, getting the car rotated in, back on the gas. Trying to hold full throttle through here without losing the back end of the car, as you can see I've done previously. Braking about 80 again. A little bit less pressure, get the car around, back end through, back on the gas. Late apex here. Again, try not to lose the back of the car. You've got to be so precise and finessed with the throttle inputs in this car. Get around, back on the throttle. But yeah, I'm really, really, really impressed with these pedals. Even if they cost a couple of $100 more than what they do, I would still be really, really impressed with these pedals. If I had to run these on my rig, I would have absolutely no hesitation in doing so whatsoever. In fact, I may even put them on my rig and drive them a little bit longer term just to sort of see how they go. I don't think there's going to be any mechanical reliability issues, but yeah, I'm absolutely loving these pedals. And you know, to talk about the throttle a little bit more as well, I've always kind of said I'm not massive on, you know, being too sensitive about what a throttle feels like. It kind of, you know, it's just a linear thing and it just does what it does. But I am really enjoying the progression that you feel in this throttle pedal. You really do get a good sense of the amount of pressure or force that you're applying to the pedal to sort of set that muscle memory, rather than it purely just being the angle of your ankle. So I don't think it's made me faster, but it definitely feels more precise. And I think, you know, if I was really focusing on driving one car and really getting down to that, you know, last few percent as I run out of fuel, I do think that it would make a difference for me at least. And again, you can make adjustments there. There's not a whole lot of adjustment available on the throttle in terms of feel. So given that we could spend literally hours talking about all the different types of feelings that you can achieve with these pedals, I think that's pretty much all that we can extract in terms of value out of a driving segment. So let's jump in now and talk about our conclusions on the VRS Direct Force Pro pedals. So conclusions on the VRS Direct Force Pro pedal set. And if you haven't figured it out already, I am a big fan of these pedals. I think, you know, in terms of the overall driving experience that these are able to provide, there's a couple of standout things there. The amount of range of adjustment, particularly on the brake pedal, is really fantastic. That's one of the things that we always loved about the Heusinkveld. So not so much the sprints, because they do have a limit that is quite low in terms of the braking pedal force available. But in the case of the Ultimate Plus pedals, the thing I always loved about them was that you can basically dial them into suit pretty much any driving style that you can imagine. If you like a relatively soft pedal for street car driving, and then you want to jump in and drive a Formula style car, you can do that. And it's exactly the same here with these VRS pedals as well, but at a lower price point. Really love what they've done in terms of the adjustment here for the uptake. So having this unique design with the tie rod, at least in my opinion, works really well. I really like the fact that they've used coil springs here instead of elastomers too. Although if implemented correctly, like what we see again with the Heusinkveld Plus pedals or something like the Mecha Cup 1 pedals, in a way that actually limits the amount of deflection available in the elastomers so that they can't blow out beyond their design tolerance, there isn't an issue with doing it that way. But I just think that this works really well. And I do think that this is going to be a little bit more reliable long term. Although if you own some of these pedals, let us know down in the comments below if you have run into any reliability concerns whatsoever. They're really quiet in operation too. So if you're sim racing in a more sensitive environment, then I don't think that's going to be an issue with these pedals. Absolutely no issues when it comes to smoothness either. Really smooth operation on all three pedals. No issues with side-to-side movement or play or anything like that either. And yeah, look, honestly, it's really hard to find anything at all to nitpick here. I think there are some other pedals on the market that are maybe a little bit easier to make adjustments to. But that said, most of those pedals don't have anywhere near the same amount of adjustment available that we have here. So it's kind of a trade-off either way. It was a little bit tricky to make some of those adjustments though, particularly just cracking some of those bolts for the very first time. You do have to make sure that you do it correctly. You will need to be careful as well. Maybe wear gloves when you're doing that, just so you don't smash your hand into any of the edges. They aren't sharp edges by any means, but you do require quite a bit of force to make some of those adjustments. So it probably would be a smart thing to do. On the software side of things, it does look a little bit dated, but it does all the things that you need it to do. The calibration is flashed to the control module as well, so that calibration will follow you across. But yeah, I think all things considered, again, coming back to that price to performance ratio, these have to be right up there with the very best pedals, if not the best pedals that we've tested here at Boosted Media to date. They perhaps still don't quite give you that same authentic feel that you get with a hydraulic pedal set, but look, in terms of all the things that you need to feel to drive quickly and consistently, I think that they've absolutely nailed it. And again, coming back to that point I made at the start of the video, where it's obvious with these pedals from a design and driving experience perspective that they've been designed by sim racers for sim racers. And I think that's something that really stands out with these pedals. So yeah, look, I mean, I guess the best praise that I can give these is that I can't imagine anybody needing anything more than this on their rig, again, from a perspective of wanting to drive quickly and consistently. And I'll put it as bluntly as this, guys. I've tested pedals here that cost 3 times more than what these cost, and I would sooner put these on my rig than some of those pedals. So I think that's probably the best praise that I can give these. I think regardless of your driving style, you're gonna be happy with these. You're gonna be able to dial them in to feel the way you wanna feel. And yeah, I really have absolutely no reason whatsoever to not recommend these. I think they're an absolutely fantastic product. And I think the way they integrate into VRS's ecosystem with the Direct Force Pro base, which you can check out our reviews on too, everything just works and they do a really good job. So really hope that today's video has helped you guys out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below as well. Let us know what you think. If you own these pedals or you're looking at getting a set of these pedals, you don't need to have pedals that are this good, but I certainly don't think that you need anything that's better than this either. So if you've got the money, I think that this is a sound investment. Obviously, you can drive quickly and consistently with pedals that cost a lot less than this, so I'm not suggesting that you need to go out and spend this kind of money on a pedal set. But if you do have the money and you're looking for a really, really awesome set of pedals, then I think that these will fit the bill just fine. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you again very soon. Bye.